So let's talk about Anne Charity Hudley. Dr. Charity Hudley is an associate professor at the College of William and Mary and the inaugural William and Mary Professor of Community Studies. She's co-authored 2 books on English language variation in classroom settings and also wrote the section on language and racialization in the Oxford Handbook of Language and Society. She's a great sociolinguistic researcher who's doing a lot of work on dialectal variation, linguistic justice, and more. We recently got a chance to talk with her, and we think you'll be fascinated by what she has to say. We started off by asking about language variation and how it connects to education.
Yes, so I work in schools, particularly in the U.S. South, where there's linguistic variation within English, but also across languages. But my emphasis has been on the interaction of African American and Southern English, people's ideas about what it is that they exist, and then what are the particulars. And for me, I use the full range of linguistics in my analysis. So I definitely consider myself a variationist and a sociolinguist, but my background in phonology, in morphosyntax, in psycholinguistics and acquisition comes to play because learning itself is such a holistic event that takes all of the different subfields in linguistics into play. And you don't really see that as much until you walk into a kindergarten classroom. So it's the social cultural, it's the dialect variation, but it's how does dialect variation intersect with acquisition in a reading environment, in a particular content area. So when I'm helping a student learn about scientific principles in a theater class, what does that mean for their phonology? What does that mean for the discourse, the speech acts of being in a classroom in between students, to a teacher, to someone when the principal walks in? So my approach to thinking about the dialectal variation is really situated in the practicalities of the school day and the school as a social system and a cultural system, but also as an educational system. So I look at dialect variation from a perspective of also education policy and language policy that can inform the teachers. But there's nothing more beautiful than just going in a classroom and listening and sitting there in the back and trying to see what's going on. And then trying to see how you can participate and help yourself be a part of that learning situation. So you're learning, but also you're contributing to the learning that's going on with the students and teachers.
Next, we talked about what linguists can take away from teachers and students in the classroom and vice versa.
That's my overall kind of approach to thinking about it. The teachers, the students, they are the linguistic experts in the situation for me at all times. And I really see a lot of my work, if you kind of take it from linguists as being descriptive, of me actually being a facilitator of bringing together the knowledge that the students possess their own knowledge. They have the agency of knowing about African American English and Southern English. So my goal is to capture that and help educators learn that, understand it, acquire the varieties for me, but also then really see and facilitate how educators use that information in their teaching praxis and their pedagogy. I think it's really important because if you think about school as a system, everything from having an interest in a student's pro-social environment, how they feel about themselves, how they think about the learning process, how do they map oral language onto print and then back into educational content. Language is such a driving piece for that. But we are really still working with schools of education, the content courses in arts and science or the major that students have to really help them think about the role of language throughout that. So in some places, you have linguistics be part of that education experience for a pre-service teacher training, particularly the first time you're going to go out. But in other places, it's not part of the training at all. Yeah. Right? And so that's why, I think it's really important to, as linguists, to kind of think about, okay, what's going on in my linguistics program, but what's going on in the other programs where a teacher would be trained and educated and talked with and empowered to make sure that language discussion is kind of part of all that process. And teachers want to know about language. Yeah. They're interacting with students. They're talking to students all day long, talking with students. They're talking at students, right? They're teaching students how to be in the world. So it's not just about the curriculum or behavior, but it's that whole kind of bringing it together. And that's why it's inherently social. Schools are a socialization process. And if we don't help educators think about the fact that they are socializing students to the world and language is left out of that, I mean, that's where the real situation of language being the last frontier of discrimination takes place.
Implicit in some of the discussion so far is the idea that language can serve as a stigmatized barrier, particularly with regard to race. We asked her about her work on language and racialization next.
Yes. So I'm a person who really sees linguistics as something that spans the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural sciences. And what I talk about a lot in that particular chapter is that as linguistics turned from more of an anthropological social science bent in the earlier days, coming from like the history of Indo-European studies, taxonomy was really important. It was really important to categorize, right? And that categorization, I wanted to make sure the new generation of linguists knew, actually came out of taxonomies that were created for racial classification and for nationalism. So we speak English because there's England. We speak French because there's France. And I noticed that for a lot of linguistic students, that kind of consideration can be divorced, such that we would start to categorize or name languages, kind of have we seen the traditional like tree maps or thinking about language families, but really wanted people to think about, hey, this is also a way to serve to preserve people's notions of nation states that may not be the way that people who are indigenous or particular racial groups or people who are from Creole diasporas actually think about themselves. So I think it's really important that, we would say, oh, we know that kind of, but I wanted to sit down and kind of map that out. So when we say someone speaks African-American English or is African-American or African-American speakers, or someone speaks Spanish versus different varieties of Creoles, what does that really mean? And how have linguists actually served to preserve these artificial categories? But at the same time, I talk about how the categories are real, but just in different ways. And we're seeing a lot of discussion now of multiculturalism, people who have multiple parts to their identity, such that race is a social construct. Race is an experience, right? So you become a race because people tell you that you are that race, and you can't escape that, even though people resist it, which is great. But at the same time, race is also a community of practice and an ethos. Right. And we haven't paid as much attention in linguistics in particular about race being a set of cultural practices, right? So if I'm African American, it's not just how I look or my social group or a process of discrimination that happened to me. It's a set of values and practices and conversation. And I think that needs to be brought into our linguistic analysis. And so I really kind of lay out the ways that some really great people in anthropology and education have been thinking about that, to bring that to bear on linguistics in general.
But if that racialized framework is the way a lot of linguists have been trained, how should we get away from that?
I think it's complicating it through giving knowledge about language back to speakers, right? So there's some kind of linguistic myths or some linguistic kind of narratives that come up. And one is that speakers don't know about their own languages, right? And kind of, then we say the role of the trained linguist, someone who really knows about language, is to go in and demystify language for other people and help them see the ordered, structured, regular practice that it is. And we're doing that and thinking about that as a way of empowering someone. So if I can show you that my language variety is structured and regular and has rules, then that somehow gives it a greater credence. Right. But I think what you're seeing in the new generation of people of color, people of different ethnic groups, social culture groups, is that once we kind of just think about race and sexual orientation and social constructs as fluid, those taxonomies don't really serve us as much anymore. Right. So to say African American English is great because it's structural, it has rules, and here's how it works, but things are a little bit more fuzzy, people are actually a little bit more apprehensive. So what do speakers actually feel about their language? Do they really consider themselves part of a linguistic group? Why not? And how does that break down into the different particles of language?
This is a great approach, but it can be hard to talk with speakers of less prestigious dialects about their speech. How should we try to do that?
I think that's a hard challenge, especially in the communities that I work in and live in and work with. People are very conscious of their language. When you're in the South, Southerners know that there's a whole discourse and feelings about their language varieties, whether they share them or not. And you may be in a room with 20 people and they all have different ideas about the way that they speak. If they're proud of it, they may be proud of parts of it. They may use it to endear people at certain times. They might not know they have a Southern accent ever, or even in some instances, right? A lot of the students I work with, they'll say, oh, I didn't really know that was part of Southern English, right? I thought I was speaking standardized English. But who am I really to tell them that? right?
Yeah.
So you don't want to be the linguist to necessarily come in and say, oh, that right there, oh, that is African American English, that is standardized, without putting it in a cultural context of saying, here's a shared experience that people have had, here's how people think about it, here's how you can kind of be part of that dialogue of constructing that language or that language identity or that language variety without assigning it to someone. Right. And I think that's the way you kind of actually build that sensitivity and help people kind of think about it and talk about it and be able to share, is to build a sense of empowerment that they command their language and they are actually informing you rather than the other way around. And you can do that over time, but you can, in an hour with a group of teachers, really change that tide when you put yourself as, oh, here's some things that I've heard about the variety. Do you use them? How do you feel about it? How do you feel about it when I say it? Okay, now you all say it as a group or say it to someone next to you. And what do you feel? Does it come out easily? Are you having to really try to, articulate or do that sound or that grammatical pattern a different way? Do you have it inherently? Do you know what it means? Does saying it in this context of this room or this setting with the people you're around cause you to feel a certain way or not? Yeah. And so when you bring that level of discussion into that, it allows voices to come out much differently than if I were just going to teach, okay, here's the morphosyntactic grammatical pattern of, And it ties the sociolinguistic aspects back to the different particles of language, because you could do this with individual linguistic features or you could do it more broadly. Yeah. Have you ever experienced someone really commenting about your language variety? Or how do you feel? Do you think that people say ain't around here, and how do you feel when they're doing it, right? So it can be discrete and micro, or it can be macro.
Okay, so that's a good sense of how to approach the speakers that you're working with. But how do we talk to the general public or other scientists about these topics? How can we get them to see why these issues are interesting and important to address?
I think you have to do it in a couple of different parts. The first thing I say is when I walk into a room and I'm trying to work with people on these ideas is I'm not going to convince everyone. Right. So you have to give yourself that freedom at the beginning. Sure. There are going to be people who come along quickly, who find it as their new thing. They're going to integrate it into their teaching or their thinking and their practice or policy. And there are people who are going to be diametrically opposed, right? So for me, that's very important, because if you work with large numbers of people on this, that's going to be the case. The next thing that I would think about is really building a sense of linguistic justice into the conversation. And for me, that's through building empathy. So most everyone has had their language commented on in some way, positive, negative, or neutral. It may be spoken language, it may be written language, it may be signed language, but some form. And really bring that speaker's own language and linguistic kind of history and practice, autobiography, into the conversation, no matter what your approach is. So it may just be to think generally about language, and that languages vary and that languages are equal, or it may be that you're coming in to do specific support for language variety or a different language and a language, a multilingual situation, and help speakers really feel like they are part of that linguistic conversation. You can, once you do that, I'll often start and see if that person has an experience, but it may be a close relative, a first or second order relative, their mom or their grandmom, or a friend of theirs, or maybe someone they really cared about in their life who spoke a different variety or a different language, and you can build that empathy that way. What you will find is that will bring another group of people along, right? They say, oh yeah, that has happened to me. Okay, now I can see those parallels. But that's not going to bring everyone. Some people say, no, I speak that variety and I wish I didn't, right? So that's not going to bring everyone, but it's going to bring empathy and justice into the way you approach the conversation. Then for me, what's really important is tying these ideas of linguistic discrimination to racial discrimination, to other forms of social discrimination, and helping people see that parallel. That's when I get that third group of people who are saying, you know what, I really don't like how this sounds. To me, it still sounds country or uneducated. But you know what, I can see what you're saying, that this is also tied to forms of racism or sexism or discrimination. And when you make people engage that, even if they don't feel like right away they love that variety or they love your concepts, they can start to understand that those things are related.
Because they're thinking about it slightly differently, yeah.
Exactly. And what I found is, even when I was starting out, but other linguists, we still just try to argue it from the linguistic standpoint. And that, for me and my colleague Christine Mallinson, we realized that wasn't working, right? I can argue with you about the copula all day and how awesome it is and how regular absence relates to contraction. But if I'm not sitting there talking to you about the history of racial oppression in the U.S. South and the way that social lines have been drawn by how people look, how they sound, what they wear, where they live, and could help you intellectually and socially and emotionally connect that together, we're just not going to get that far. And so with more people who are more resistant, that empathy will be built sometimes with just thinking about the injustice and discrimination and not focusing first on the linguistic issue or even linguistic discrimination, but just a conversation about discrimination in general. Right? If you see empathy, you know, there's a big, you know, some challenges now when you think about people who are gay with intersection with race. So how, using that same approach, you build empathy that way. Okay, so if people discriminate against you, why are you trying to do it, right? And we've seen traction and change in this country, even in churches and, you know, other places that have been, you know, even changing their message. Once that is the discourse that you have to engage with. Are you willing to be discriminatory in this way once this parallel has been laid out for you? Some people will say, hell yeah. But then others are going to say, no, you know what, let me think about this again.
So let's say we've gotten some people on board through discussion and empathy. Where should we go from there?
And then the other piece for me that's really important is to think about, when does all of this become legislation and policy? And I think that's an area where I want to encourage linguists, young linguists, new linguists to think about that this doesn't just have to stop with the eloquent in class or in workshop or, you know, in video argument, that we can do better to lobby, like, what are practices and policies. And I've worked on that a lot for the Commonwealth of Virginia, but also, you know, our work is referenced in the codes and mandates of Pennsylvania. My advisor, Bill LeBove, wrote a guideline for textbooks and teaching in California. We can really start to build this into what is required. Not to be oppressive, but following the voices of underrepresented people to make sure that they are represented in the curriculum, in the teaching policies, in what does it mean to be an educated, well-qualified teacher of everything from preschool through graduate school. So what are your policies about how you, as a linguistics department or program, are selecting your candidates based on their SAT, GRE scores or something like that, right? And having policies and guidelines for people.
And getting people involved in these topics and in policy isn't the only way to engage. We should also try getting more people and younger people involved in linguistics, learning about it and doing research.
Yeah, I think it's so important, particularly for linguistics as a whole, but for individual students, to really encourage linguistics departments and programs to actively encourage students to get involved in undergraduate research early. If there's not support in your department or program, you know, many colleges and universities now are thinking more broadly across campuses about ways to get involved. And I really see it as a two-way street. Students who are undergrads bring amazing insights to classic linguistic questions, new ways of thinking about language. They're still kind of at the tail end of the critical period and able to acquire and listen and process language in really important ways that I think is just really valuable for just core understanding of what we're doing as a area or discipline or field. In the social cultural context of language analysis, so in social linguistics and linguistic anthropology, but I would argue every area, they are students from those communities. Right. So whether you're into the morphosyntax of an indigenous language, having a student from that community who's not just a participant, right? Because I don't even use that model anymore, but who is an active researcher and thinking about those questions is so important. And if you can allow someone like that to do that for 20, 30, 40 years, like a longer period than just through grad school, that breadth of intellectual knowledge that they will have and that they will contribute will be fantastic. Right. And if you think about these issues of inclusion, linguistic justice, I mean, the way that we as linguists can deal with these issues of, well, I'm going to tell you to go speak your own variety, but really when you come to college, you're going to have to speak a different way. The best way for us to really think about long-term solutions to some of those built-in hypocrisies is to work with undergraduates and really think about what those solutions should be. Yeah. So I just really want to encourage people, if you haven't been doing it yet, to reach out on your campus to me or others to really think about how you can get that started. It doesn't have to be a huge program. It could just be one or two students that work with you or that you meet with, or just come and sit in your lab time, or if you're just working on something, have them read it too and spend some time talking about it, because that's going to strengthen your own research. It's going to empower a student in just amazing ways, but it's going to strengthen what we do overall.
We also asked her about the role of social media in science communication.
I think the role of Twitter, social media, I'm on Twitter and Facebook basically every day. I do some LinkedIn every once in a while. But you know what I think about a lot when I'm doing it? I'm thinking about an African-American kid who lives somewhere in Alabama and is really interested in going to some awesome school one day to study whatever they're interested in, not just linguistics. And they don't necessarily have access to faculty that they can talk to or topics, but they see you sharing information and seeing you share yourself as a person, as an individual, and how empowering that can be for people that you don't encounter every day. So people will say to me, gosh, you're on there a lot, but that student is always in my mind. And increasingly that student will now write me or call me or tweet me. And that sense of empowerment and access that goes along with sharing that information is just as important, I think. And it just engages with people. So there's many more people now I see at the conference, like you, who are my Twitter friends that I hadn't seen before. And it's also a really good way to kind of lead into some of these tougher conversations, because it gives people a chance to kind of think and pause and be part of a larger discussion. And, heavily if they want to comment or tweet back a lot, or less so if they just kind of want to watch a conversation or just get the information. So you can engage in different ways. Yeah, and it's important for, like I said, so the kid who's out there that no one's supporting, that's in that situation, to know that you're doing this and to see it and see who you're engaging with. I've just really, especially, my focus has been so much on teaching undergraduates and students who, for a lot of times, coming to college just opens up a whole different world, not just educationally, but feeling like they're accepted by someone, understanding. And that allows them to gear up for that in advance. And you don't have to just be in high school for that, right? You could be the college student who's looking for the next best situation, or a new faculty member who feels like no one at my institution is talking about or cares what I'm talking about. And it allows us to connect so quickly. So I really see it as a way to mitigate what, in the literature is called solo status, like feeling like you're the only one out there of your social or demographic group, but also someone who cares about the issues that you,
No,
so there's a lot of power in that hashtag.
Yep, So that's it. Thanks again to Dr. Charity Hudley for her time and for sharing her insights with us. We hope that you enjoyed the interview, and we'll have more interviews with linguists for you soon. And we've got a regular episode on child syntax for you next time as well. See you then.